I was a child of the mid to late 2000s, through to the early 2010s, and I'd like to consider myself lucky for it. I was among the last group of people who would have the privilege of experiencing the golden age of the internet, as it were. I remember spending countless afternoons playing browser games in Flash like Club Penguin, obsessively reading up on video games and astronomy via Wikipedia and its many derivatives, and terrifying myself with the now laughable creepypasta tales so prevalent at the time. Most impactful to my current self, however, was my time spent entertaining myself by spending a considerable amount of time devoted entirely to browsing YouTube. Alongside comedic skits and amateur forays into short filmmaking, I had a fondness for video game footage. Not necessarily reviews or playthroughs, but straight, unaltered, raw footage from retro games, especially arcade titles. Seeing as I typically had a budget of around $5 and was unaware of the existence of MAME, actually playing these classic and not-so-classic titles was simply out of the question for me. Thus, I'd watch stock footage for countless hours. One of the games I especially enjoyed watching footage of was Nintendo's iconic and classic smash hit Donkey Kong, and it was during one of my several spectating binges that I'd stumbled across a video titled Crazy Kong that would become a fixation and fascination in its own right. It was Donkey Kong, or so I'd thought, but things just weren't right. My obsessive kid brain kicked in and became perplexed and mildly frustrated. The sounds were sparser, just about all of the audio clips were entirely foreign to the cabinet, and most alarming to me, the colors were just out of this world. They were all wrong. The girders were green, Kong appeared much paler than in the typical game, and Mario resembled a Christmas elf with a bright green shirt and equally bright red overalls, among other details. The fact that Pauline's dress was blood red and she was floating atop the girder was just the kicker. This wasn't the Donkey Kong I remembered, nor was it the Donkey Kong I remembered, or even the Donkey Kong Okay, the point is that I've just grown accustomed to the several inconsistencies and wide variety of interpretations of the ape and his role in gaming, and yet this was still completely out of left field. I was gripped immediately. I tried to look for information regarding the video, though I often used improper and vague search terms, and thus my efforts often proved ineffective. Recently, however, I decided to resurrect my search, and it was only now that I had the bright idea of using that same video title, Crazy Kong, as my keyword. I was finally able to find the game in playable form, putting my childhood search to rest. For those unaware, Crazy Kong is a 1981 arcade title, often erroneously believed to be a bootleg of Nintendo's classic Donkey Kong from the same year. Such is not the case, however. Essentially, Donkey Kong was Nintendo's first real success in the highly strategically significant North American market, and so they'd funneled most of their resources and efforts toward manufacturing and exporting cabinets for the same region. This, however, then wrought the consequence of Nintendo struggling to produce enough machines to meet the demand from the Japanese market for the game. Thus, to compensate and alleviate this burden, Nintendo would opt to do something that they haven't done often since: commission another company to license their intellectual property and produce cabinets of their own and distribute them themselves. The developer in question that Nintendo would turn to was none other than the mysterious Falcon, which I've been unable to find even a trace of proof for existence of, beyond a copyright credit for some editions of the game. Yeah, I think it's important to note that there exists more than one singular Crazy Kong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The project Falcon developed was intended to be as faithful to the source material as possible, although the inner workings of the machine were almost entirely separate to Nintendo's original, with the title being programmed based on the hardware of an unrelated game, Nichibutsu's 1980 Crazy Climber, but we don't care about that game. Oh no! At least not now, anyway. My only question remaining at this point is, have you played Crazy Kong? Upon plugging the machine in, one is greeted with a rather familiar-looking high scoreboard setup, albeit with slightly different font coloring. Though rest assured, this is only the beginning of several visual differences. What's more, upon inserting a credit, an entirely different soundbite plays, being reused from the bounce effect, which of course has also been altered. Naturally, upon inserting a credit, one can press the start button, and the thematic cutscene that introduces the game, featuring Donkey, or Crazy Kong, climbing to a 25-meter construction site. Accompanying this is a dedicated yet still alarmingly off-key rendition of Nintendo's opening warble, as yet another different soundbite plays for each of the gorilla's stomps, which shatter and bend the girders supporting him as well as those below. The game then aggravates language arts teachers and English majors everywhere, as it states a question to you, a slight variation on Nintendo's "How high can you get?", here shown as "How high can you try?". As with Nintendo's incarnation, the game has a simple plot. You, the player, control a carpenter whose lady love has been carried up your place of work by a menacing ape who tries his hardest to kill you by tossing and otherwise manipulating construction and other blue-collar work equipment. You can walk horizontally and climb up ladders to progress, and you can additionally press on one fire button to jump over gaps, obstacles, and in order to grab hammers hanging from the walls of some levels. The level designs themselves, being intended to replicate Donkey Kong, are naturally almost identical to the original, although various color palette and select sprite tile changes are different. That being said, these differences have almost no bearing on the actual gameplay and are minor details, such as differing obstacle destruction tiles, which also linger on screen for a much longer amount of time, as well as this sprite of Crazy Kong that appears in the game's later boards. Look at that! That's horrifying! He looks rabid! That being said, there are some graphical quirks that do negatively affect gameplay, such as the lack of consistent animation, which is mostly attacking detail on the barrel screen, as it makes it almost impossible to predict when Crazy Kong will toss his pattern barrels, and most worrisome, when he'll toss rogue barrels directly below or scattering across the screen. For shame, Falcon! Moving on, there are some details in the gameplay that set Crazy Kong apart from Nintendo's original, mostly being some minor logic and physics differences, such as the elevator platforms in the 75-meter level, which are much sparser in appearance and are quite unpredictable. Furthermore, various holes and girders appear, letting you fall to your death as the game progresses, which adds to a much steeper overall spike in difficulty as you further traverse the levels. However, almost as though to compensate, the game does start at a lower overall difficulty when you first boot it up from plugging in, with much slower initial enemy patterns and sluggish, highly lenient and permitting time limits. My only real complaint toward this game is the hit detection, which is rather odd in particular, with backtracking and wide turns being required to retrieve items, especially the hammers, the only tool you can use to destroy obstacles, most notably fire. Further complicating this issue is the placement of hammers themselves, which is rather unhelpful, with the 100-meter screen being a particular offender, as hammers appear halfway off the girders below, forcing the player to take the risk of falling to their death by partially standing off the girders and jumping. At this point, having given a basic gameplay overview, I think it's appropriate for me to revisit my initial thought concerning the other versions of Crazy Kong, such as the deceptively named Crazy Kong Part 2, which, aside from a short attract sequence and a new color scheme, is entirely identical to the original. That being said, I do prefer the second edition, just due to its aesthetic appeal to myself, but that's just me. Further still is yet another version of Crazy Kong by the same original title, though this is where it gets interesting. It's presumed to truly be a bootleg this time, though information is incredibly barren on this particular incarnation, which has instead been programmed and built entirely upon modified Galaxian hardware, which is an incredibly impressive technical feat due to the limitations of Galaxian's hardware, especially in comparison to Donkey Kong. I wish to commend the game's physics and controls, which are rather tight and responsive in the vein of Namco's title, even in comparison to the original Donkey Kong, which itself has rather delayed controls. Further adding to my particular enjoyment of this title are the responsive hitboxes and some of the best uses of almost unadulterated Galaxian soundbites in this game, such as the large booms from Kong's stomps and barrel smashes from the hammer, which I find incredibly appealing and I'm rather fond of. Beyond simple presentation differences, I wish to note that, unlike the previous two Crazy Kongs, this game is actually closer to the standard arcade predictability and difficulty settings, and even has some properties of logic from Donkey Kong's second location and onward immediately. Overall, I have to say that Falcon's efforts were admirable to say the least, and that Crazy Kong, in any of its forms, is a weird, fascinating, and fun game, as well as an interesting look in the lengths taken to program and recreate titles on more archaic hardware and limited resources. This has been the Violet Foreigner speaking, and I wish to thank you for watching.
Go for it!